One rainy night, a hard-working taxi driver struggling to make ends meet came across a frightened woman clutching her young daughter, desperation written all over her face. She needed a ride, somewhere safe, anywhere but there. He felt her fear, sensed her pain, and without hesitation, he drove her away from whatever she was running from. When they arrived, he refused her money, knowing she had nothing left to give. Little did he know, this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Just hours later, his phone buzzed with a call, one that would leave him completely stunned. It was a quiet night in New Orleans, Louisiana, the kind of evening where the streets seemed to hum with a distant melody of jazz, even when no music played. A light drizzle coated the pavement, reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights, casting long, wavering shadows across the nearly empty sidewalks. Jamal Carter, a 38-year-old taxi driver, let out a tired sigh as he guided his aging sedan through the less traveled parts of the city. He had been driving for nearly 12 hours, his back aching from the long shifts, his mind heavy with the weight of bills piling up at home. Jamal had always been a hard worker. Ever since he was a teenager, he understood that nothing in life came easy, especially for a black man trying to make an honest living. He had dreams once, big dreams. Opening his own transportation business, building something for himself and his family, leaving behind the endless cycle of 12-hour shifts and barely making ends meet. But dreams didn't pay the mortgage. Dreams didn't put food on the table for Lisa, his wife, or their 2 children, who looked up at him with wide eyes, trusting him to keep the world safe for them. The dashboard clock blinked 11:42 p.m. Just a few more rides, and he could finally head home, slip into bed beside Lisa, and steal a few hours of sleep before another long day. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional late-night wanderer, some stumbling out of bars, others just passing through. He considered calling it a night when suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a woman darting onto the sidewalk from a dark alleyway, clutching a small child to her chest. She was running. Not the hurried steps of someone caught in the rain, but the desperate, fearful sprint of someone trying to escape something, or someone. Jamal's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had learned a long time ago that getting involved in the wrong situation could be dangerous, especially this late at night. His first instinct was to keep driving. Whatever trouble she was in, it wasn't his to fix. But then he caught a glimpse of her face, illuminated briefly by a passing streetlight, pale, frightened, soaked from the rain, eyes glistening with unshed tears. The child, no older than 5 or 6, clung to her, face buried in her shoulder, their tiny arms wrapped around her neck as if their life depended on it. Jamal exhaled sharply. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath before pulling the taxi over. The woman reached the curb just as he rolled down the passenger window. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, scanning the area behind her, looking for any signs of danger. Her breath hitched, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps as she adjusted the child in her arms. "Please," she stammered. "I need to get somewhere safe. Can you take me?" Jamal hesitated. Something about the urgency in her voice unsettled him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or desperation, but it was clear that she was on the edge. "Where do you need to go?" "Anywhere. Just away from here." That was never a good sign. People didn't run like this unless they were escaping something or someone. His instinct screamed at him to refuse, to say he was off duty, to tell her to find another cab. But there was something in her eyes. Something raw, something that reminded him of the nights he had seen Lisa hold their children close when times were tough, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay even when she wasn't sure if it would be. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Get in." The woman wasted no time, slipping into the back seat, carefully maneuvering the child into her lap as she pulled the door shut behind her. Jamal glanced at them through the rearview mirror. The woman's clothes were damp, her blouse clinging to her thin frame, her blonde hair matted against her forehead. The little girl, dressed in pajamas that were slightly too big for her, was trembling but silent. "Seatbelt," Jamal reminded her automatically as he put the car in drive. She fumbled with the strap, her hands shaking as she clicked it into place. For a few minutes, the only sound in the cab was the low hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain against the windshield. Jamal kept his eyes on the road, waiting for her to speak. He knew better than to push. Sometimes, when people were ready, they talked. And if they weren't, well, he had learned that silence could tell just as much of a story. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Jamal nodded but said nothing. He wasn't doing this for gratitude. He wasn't even sure why he was doing it at all. As they drove through the dimly lit streets of New Orleans, he kept an eye on the rearview mirror. He didn't ask questions, but he noticed the way the woman's gaze flickered to the side window, scanning the dark streets as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. Whoever she was running from, she was still afraid. "Ma'am," he said carefully, breaking the silence. "You sure there's no one we need to call?" She swallowed hard, tightening her grip on the child. "No, there's no one." Jamal nodded, but something about the way she said it made him think that wasn't entirely true. Jamal kept his hand steady on the wheel, his mind working through the situation as he navigated the rain-slicked streets. The woman sat in the back, holding her child so tightly. It was as if she feared letting go would mean losing her forever. He stole a glance at them through the rearview mirror. The little girl hadn't said a word since they got in, her tiny face buried in her mother's shoulder, her small fingers clutching onto the damp fabric of her blouse. She was trembling, though whether from the cold or from fear, Jamal couldn't tell. The woman, however, was different. At first she had seemed on the verge of breaking, her breaths uneven, her posture stiff with tension. But now, as the miles stretched between them, and whatever she had run from, she was slowly regaining control, though her eyes remained vigilant, darting toward the window every few seconds, scanning the streets as if expecting someone to be following them. Jamal cleared his throat. "You got a name?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to lie, but then she sighed and relented. "Emily. My daughter's name is Grace." Emily. He rolled the name over in his mind. He'd picked up his fair share of distressed passengers before. Drunks who'd had too much to drink, couples in the middle of screaming matches, people who just needed a ride to clear their heads. But this was different. This wasn't just a bad night. This was fear. Real fear. "She okay?" he asked, glancing at the little girl through the mirror. Emily brushed a strand of wet hair from her daughter's face, her fingers trembling slightly as she tucked it behind the child's ear. "She's tired," she murmured. "It's been a long day." Jamal nodded but didn't push. He knew when someone didn't want to talk, and he wasn't about to pry. It wasn't his business. His job was to get them where they needed to go. But the tension in the air was thick, and the silence between them only made it heavier. "You got anywhere specific in mind?" he asked after a moment. Emily shook her head. "Just somewhere safe. Somewhere away." That wasn't an answer. That was an escape plan. Jamal exhaled sharply through his nose, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel as he thought. "I know a motel a few miles out, quiet place, no questions asked. Ain't fancy, but it's better than being out here in the rain." Emily nodded, looking relieved. "That sounds fine. Thank you." Jamal kept driving, the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers filling the silence between them. Every so often, he glanced in the mirror, watching the way Emily's eyes flitted from side to side, never fully relaxing. He knew that kind of fear. He'd seen it before, in people who had nowhere left to go, who had burned every bridge, and were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the uncertainty of what came next. He sighed, shaking his head slightly. He didn't know her story, but he had a feeling it wasn't simple. It never was. "Listen," he said after a while, his voice steady but firm. "I don't know what you're running from, and I ain't asking. But whatever it is, you need to be careful. People don't just run like that unless they got something real bad chasing them." Emily's fingers tightened around Grace. For a moment he thought she might ignore him, but then she spoke, her voice quiet, almost fragile. "I left my husband tonight. He's not a good man." Jamal didn't say anything, just kept his eyes on the road, letting her find her words. He controls everything," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "For years, I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just played along it would be okay. But it never was. And tonight, I knew if I didn't leave, I never would." Jamal's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask what she meant by that. He'd seen enough in his life to understand what some men were capable of. Emily let out a shaky breath. I thought I could do it alone. But I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anywhere to go, and then you stopped. She swallowed hard, her fingers brushing gently against Grace's cheek. You didn't have to, but you did. Jamal felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Just doing what felt right, he muttered. Emily let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. Not a lot of people would. Jamal didn't respond to that. Maybe she was right. Maybe most people would kept driving, but he wasn't most people. A few minutes later, they pulled into the lot of a small roadside motel, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you had cash. The neon vacancy sign buzzed softly, casting a dull red glow over the rain-slicked pavement. Jamal parked near the entrance and turned in his seat. You sure about this place? Emily nodded. It's fine. Jamal exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. He held them out to her. Emily blinked in surprise. What? For the room, he said simply. Her eyes widened. I can't. Yeah, you can, Jamal interrupted. You got more important things to worry about right now. Emily stared at him for a long moment, then, with trembling fingers, took the money. Her eyes were glassy, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Thank you, she whispered. Jamal nodded and turned back to the wheel. You get inside. Keep your head down. And whatever you do, don't go back. Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod before pushing the door open. She stepped out into the rain, adjusting Grace in her arms. As she hurried toward the motel entrance, Jamal sat in silence, watching them go. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. He didn't even know if she'd be okay. But something in his gut told him that what he did tonight mattered. Maybe it wouldn't change the world. Maybe it wouldn't fix all the broken pieces of Emily's life. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. Jamal drove home in silence, the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers the only sound accompanying him through the dark, rain-slicked streets. The air inside the cab was still thick with the scent of damp fabric, a lingering reminder of the woman and child who had sat in his back seat just moments ago. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's hollow, frightened eyes or the way she clutched her daughter as if letting go would mean losing her forever. He had done what he could, gotten them to a safe place, given them a little cash. That was all. That was enough. At least, that's what he told himself. When he finally pulled up outside his small, modest house, the street was quiet, save for the occasional drip of rainwater spilling off the gutters. The neighborhood wasn't much, but it was home, a place he had fought hard to keep despite the mounting bills and endless financial strain. With a tired groan, he shut off the engine and rubbed his eyes before stepping out of the car. He moved carefully, trying not to wake anyone as he unlocked the front door and slipped inside. Lisa was already asleep, her figure curled beneath the blankets, her breathing soft and steady. He lingered in the doorway of their bedroom for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest, before he let out a quiet sigh and sank onto the couch in the living room. His body ached, exhaustion settling deep into his bones, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He thought about Emily. He thought about the little girl, Grace, and the way she hadn't spoken a single word the entire ride. He thought about how many women like Emily were out there, running from something, or someone, and how few of them had anywhere to go. He had done the right thing. He knew that. But still something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. He was drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep when his phone buzzed against the coffee table. He frowned, his fingers fumbling as he reached for it. A number he didn't recognize flashed across the screen. It was late, too late for a normal call. His gut told him to ignore it. But something, that same feeling that had made him pull over for Emily in the first place, urged him to pick up. He hesitated for only a moment before swiping to answer. Yeah? There was a brief pause, then a voice, calm, composed, but with an undeniable air of authority. Is this Jamal Carter? Jamal sat up, suddenly wide awake. Who's asking? My name is Jonathan Whitmore. I believe you gave a ride to my daughter earlier this evening. Jamal's breath caught in his chest. Emily's father. His grip on the phone tightened. His first instinct was to hang up. He didn't know what kind of man he was dealing with, but the last thing he needed was trouble from some powerful, wealthy family looking to track down a runaway daughter. "She's safe," Jamal said cautiously, his voice measured. "That's all you need to know." "I know," the man responded evenly. "She told us." Jamal frowned. That wasn't the reaction he expected. "She also told us what you did for her," Jonathan continued. "And we need to talk." Jamal stiffened. Here it comes. The accusations. The threats. Maybe even some kind of legal action. Rich people didn't take kindly to outsiders getting involved in their business. "I don't want any trouble," he said. "There is no trouble, Mr. Carter," Jonathan replied. "But my family would like to meet you. Tomorrow. In person." Jamal narrowed his eyes. Every instinct told him to say no, to stay as far away from this as possible. But curiosity gnawed at him. "Why?" There was a brief pause before Jonathan answered. "Because you helped my daughter when she needed it most, and that is something we don't take lightly." Jamal exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. "I'll text you the address," Jonathan added. 10 o'clock sharp. Before Jamal could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind spinning. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? The next morning, Jamal woke earlier than usual, though he wasn't sure he had ever really fallen asleep. His mind had been turning over the events of the night before, replaying every detail, every word exchanged between him and the man on the phone, Jonathan Whitmore. Even without looking him up, Jamal knew the name carried weight. It was a name attached to power, to wealth, to influence, the kind of influence that could either ruin a man or change his life entirely. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. The idea of meeting a family like the Whitmores didn't sit right with him. He wasn't someone who mingled with the rich, and he didn't trust people with too much money. They lived in a different world, a world where men like him were invisible unless they served a purpose. The question was, what purpose did he serve to them? Lisa stirred beside him, her voice groggy. "You're up early." Jamal glanced at her, debating whether to tell her. He didn't like keeping things from his wife, but he also didn't want to worry her over something that could turn out to be nothing. "Yeah," he said finally, standing up. "Got a thing I need to take care of." Lisa sat up, watching him with that sharp gaze of hers, the one that always saw right through him. "A thing? What kind of thing?" Jamal sighed. There was no hiding it. "Some rich guy called me last night, said he was Emily's father. Wants to meet today." Lisa blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Wait, Emily? The woman you helped?" Jamal nodded. "Tom." Lisa frowned. "Why would they want to meet you?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Lisa crossed her arms, her concern evident. "You sure this isn't some kind of setup? You don't know these people, Jamal. You don't know what they want." "I know," he admitted. "But something tells me I need to find out." Lisa studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Just be careful, okay?" Jamal gave her a small, reassuring nod before heading for the shower. By 9:45 a.m., Jamal was pulling into an area of New Orleans he rarely ventured into, Uptown, the historic district where money practically dripped from the iron-wrought balconies and manicured gardens. The houses here weren't just homes, they were estates, each one more imposing than the last. The kind of places Jamal had only ever seen through his rearview mirror, while driving passengers who had never given him a second glance. The Whitmore estate was no exception. A towering white-columned mansion sat at the end of a long, circular driveway, surrounded by meticulously trimmed hedges and towering oak trees. A stone fountain gurgled at the center of the driveway, the kind of extravagance that made Jamal shift uncomfortably in his seat. As he parked his car, an aging sedan that looked painfully out of place among the polished luxury vehicles lining the driveway, he took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but there was no turning back now. The front door opened before he even reached it. A tall, suited man with salt and pepper hair and a presence that commanded attention stepped out. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but his sharp blue eyes studied Jamal with quiet intensity. "Mr. Carter, The man greeted, his voice smooth but firm. "Thank you for coming." Jamal inclined his head slightly. "Guess I didn't have much of a choice." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's face. "I suppose not." "Jonathan Whitmore, I assume?" "That would be correct." Jamal hesitated for a beat before stepping forward. "So, what exactly am I doing here?" Jonathan gestured toward the open door. "Why don't we discuss that inside?" Jamal followed him into the house, immediately feeling out of place among the high ceilings, polished wooden floors, and expensive artwork that probably cost more than he made in a year. The place smelled like old money, a mix of fine leather, aged whiskey, and the kind of wealth that had been passed down through generations. Jonathan led him into a large sitting room where Emily was waiting, sitting on an elegant, cream-colored couch. She looked better than she had the night before. Her hair was neatly brushed, her clothes clean. But there was still a lingering wariness in her eyes. She stood as soon as she saw him. "Jamal." Jamal gave her a nod. "You doing okay?" She smiled faintly. "Better, thanks to you." Jonathan stepped forward. "Sit, please." Jamal hesitated before lowering himself into one of the armchairs. He wasn't used to being in places like this, and he sure as hell wasn't used to being treated like a guest in a house like this. Jonathan sat across from him, his expression serious. "You should know that when my daughter returned home last night, she told us everything. About what she's been through. About what she's been running from. And about the man who helped her when she had no one else." Jamal said nothing, waiting for whatever was coming next. "You didn't have to stop for her," Jonathan continued. "Most people wouldn't have." Jamal shrugged. "Did what anyone should have done." Jonathan studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "No, Mr. Carter, what you did, that's rare." Jamal shifted slightly. He didn't like being put on a pedestal for something that, to him, had just been the right thing to do. "Look, I'm glad she's safe," he said, glancing at Emily before turning back to Jonathan. "But I get the feeling this isn't just a thank you visit. So why am I really here?" Jonathan exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "My family has been through a lot, Mr. Carter. And while we may have money, it has never been our belief that wealth alone defines a person's worth. We believe in people. We believe in those who do good, even when there's nothing to gain from it." Jamal narrowed his eyes slightly. "And—" Jonathan paused before speaking again. "We want to help you." Jamal blinked, caught off guard. "Help me?" Jonathan nodded. "Emily told us about your situation, about how hard you work, about your family, about your dream of owning your own business." Jamal's stomach tightened. He didn't like the idea of his struggles being laid out on the table like that, no matter how well-intentioned. "I don't need charity," he said firmly. "This isn't charity," Jonathan corrected. "This is an opportunity. One you've earned." Jamal frowned. "What kind of opportunity?" Jonathan exchanged a glance with Emily before continuing. "We own multiple businesses in the city, including a transportation company. We'd like to offer you a management position there, a real chance to build something stable for yourself and your family. And if you prove yourself in time, we'll help you start your own." Jamal stared at him, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a chance to change everything. He folded his arms, his voice guarded. "And what do you get out of it?" Jonathan smiled slightly. "We get to help a good man get what he deserves. That's enough for me." Jamal looked at Emily, who gave him an encouraging nod. He exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. This was more than he had ever expected, more than he had ever dared to hope for. And yet, deep down, he knew that nothing in life came easy. This wasn't just a gift. It was a test. And now he had to decide if he was willing to take it. Jamal sat there, his fingers interlocked, his mind racing. The weight of Jonathan Whitmore's offer pressed down on him, heavy and unexpected. This wasn't just some handout. It was a chance, a real chance, to break free from the never-ending cycle of scraping by, to finally build something for himself and his family. And yet, the idea of stepping into their world, of working under a man like Jonathan, made his stomach tighten. His entire life, he had fought for everything he had. Nothing had ever come easy, and he had learned, through years of disappointments and letdowns, that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. He had seen too many men like him get caught up in promises that never fully materialized, treated like a token gesture of goodwill only to be discarded when their usefulness ran out. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice level. "Why me?" Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Because we believe in rewarding the right people." Jamal scoffed. "Yeah. And what happens if I say no?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Then you walk out that door, and nothing changes. You go back to your life, to your job, to the struggle. We won't interfere, and you'll never hear from us again." He paused, eyes steady. "But if you say yes, you get a real shot at something better. Not just for yourself, but for your family." Jamal's jaw tightened. He could feel the heat of Emily's gaze on him, silently urging him to take the offer. But it wasn't that simple. He couldn't afford to owe anyone, especially not a family like this. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice sharp. Jonathan smiled faintly. "No catch. Just hard work. I won't hand you success, Jamal. You'll have to earn it. The position I'm offering you is real. The expectations will be high, and you'll have to prove yourself just like anyone else. But if you do, if you show me that the man who stopped for my daughter is the same man who can lead a business, then I'll personally invest in helping you start your own." Jamal studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, any hidden agenda lurking beneath the surface. But Jonathan's expression remained steady, unwavering. This wasn't pity. This wasn't charity. This was a test. He glanced at Emily. She hadn't spoken much since the conversation began, but her eyes held a quiet plea. A thank you. A hope that he would take the offer not just for himself, but because she wanted to see something good come out of everything that had happened. Jamal exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "I don't trust rich folks," he admitted. "Never have." Jonathan's lips quirked in the barest hint of amusement. "I can't say I blame you." Jamal sat in silence for a few beats longer, weighing his options. Then, finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "I'll give it a shot." A flicker of approval passed through Jonathan's eyes. He extended his hand. "Welcome aboard." Jamal hesitated for only a second before grasping it. The handshake was firm, solid, carrying the weight of something bigger than just a deal. "Come by the office tomorrow morning," Jonathan said, standing up. "We'll get you started." Jamal nodded, rising from his chair. He turned to Emily, offering her a small nod. "Take care of yourself, all right?" She smiled, genuine this time. "You too, Jamal." The next morning, Jamal found himself standing outside Whitmore Logistics, a sleek, glass-paneled building that looked nothing like the places he had worked before. He adjusted the collar of his only decent button-up shirt, rolling his shoulders to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He had spent most of his life behind the wheel of a cab, navigating the streets of New Orleans, and now he was about to step into a world completely foreign to him. A security guard greeted him at the entrance, checking his name before directing him to an elevator that carried him to the top floor. He wasn't sure what he expected when he stepped into Jonathan's office. Maybe something cold, impersonal, a place that screamed power and control. Instead, he found himself in a well-lit room lined with bookshelves and framed photographs, a mix of business and family life woven together. Jonathan was already seated at his desk, reviewing paperwork, but he looked up as soon as Jamal entered. "Right on time," he noted. Jamal smirked faintly. "Figured I shouldn't be late on my first day." Jonathan motioned for him to sit. "Let's get one thing straight before we begin," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "You don't work for me, you work for yourself. Every decision you make from this point forward determines your future. If you fail, it's on you. If you succeed, it's because you earned it. I'll open the door for you, but you'll have to walk through it on your own." Jamal nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The next few weeks were brutal. The corporate world was nothing like the streets. The numbers, the contracts, the logistics, it was a language he wasn't fluent in, a system built for people who had spent their lives behind desks instead of steering wheels. There were moments where he wanted to walk out, to tell Jonathan this wasn't for him. But every time doubt crept in, he thought about Lisa, his kids, the life he had been fighting to build. So he pushed through. He studied harder than he ever had, showing up early and staying late, proving to Jonathan and to himself that he wasn't just some charity case. He was a man who refused to fail. And when the 3-month mark arrived, Jonathan called him into his office. "You've done well," he said simply. Jamal folded his arms, waiting for the but. Instead, Jonathan slid a file across the desk. "This is the paperwork to secure funding for your own business." Jamal stared at it, his chest tightening. "Just like that?" Jonathan chuckled. "Not just like that. You earned it." Jamal ran a hand over his face, exhaling. This was it, the break he had spent his life chasing. "Welcome to the next chapter, Jamal," Jonathan said, standing. "Let's see what you do with it." Jamal shook his hand, this time not as an employee, but as an equal. A year later, Carter Transportation Services officially opened its doors. Jamal stood outside his new office, the sign freshly hung, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years, pride. Lisa was at his side, his kids beaming up at him. Emily had stopped by too, standing quietly in the background, smiling. He had built this. Not because someone handed it to him. Not because he got lucky. Because he had chosen to stop for a stranger in the rain. Because he had chosen to believe in himself. Because sometimes the smallest choices end up being the ones that change everything. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.